Surveying Christianity's African Roots. Session 11. Vandals invade Northwest Africa. Nubian Christianity and the disappearance of Christianity from Africa's Northwest from the 5th through mid-6th century AD. Let's begin with a review of the previous session. In session 10, we talked about how Africa hardened Nicene Christian philosophy. We mentioned Aurelius, Archbishop of Carthage. Aurelius's declaration of heretics. We talked about Augustine, Bishop of Hippo Regius, his life and his African consciousness. We listed the contributions of Augustine of Hippo to Christianity. Then we talked about the subject of growing desert faith communities in Northeast Africa. We began discussing the transformation of Egypt's concept of desert spirituality. We talked about the life of Moses the Black and the Desert Fathers. We also talked about how Africa hardened Nicene Christian ecclesiology. We listed the code of canons from the Africa-specific church councils. We also talked about how the canons from those African church councils were the gold standard of their day. Now let's see what we'll survey in today's session. Today, we are going to look at the Vandal invasion of North Africa, Vandal persecution of African Christians, Gelasius, the Berber Pope of Rome, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, and the Berber king Masuna conquer the Vandals. The gradual rise of Christianity in Nubia. The disappearance of Christianity from Northwest Africa. And the rise of Islam. So let's begin with the Vandal invasion of North Africa. So who were the Vandals? Their ethnicity? Well, they were a Germanic people from Eastern Europe, but they did not share biology, language, physical appearance, nor cultural preferences. It was an ideology that defined their ethnic cohesion. However, that ideology was not fixed, as it varied in response to the politics and economics at hand. At the time of their North African invasion, the chief concern of Vandals was separating themselves from the Roman inhabitants of the region in which they lived. Their religion. Vandals were Arian Christians of the Puritan order who rejected the teachings about the Holy Trinity. To be specific, they did not believe that Jesus's nature was the same as the Father's nature. About their invasion, in the 5th century AD, with the help of the Moors, the Vandals ravaged Western Europe's territories known today as Spain, Portugal, France, and Italy, as well as Rome's African provinces of Nubia and Carthage. They became a wandering, massive group that invaded cities and towns in Europe, but of particular interest to our research in this session were their clashes with the Berbers in Africa, with Rome, with Donatists, and with Catholics. So that said, let's look at these clashes that the Vandals had. First, we'll look at the clashes with the Berbers. With the help of the Moors of Mauritania in 429 AD, the Vandals, 80,000 men strong, invaded North Africa. However, due to Berber resistance, they could not make any significant settlements further inland. Berber resistance resulted in the Berber establishment of self-rule 3 months after the Vandal invasion of Hipporegius in Nubia. The great Bishop Augustine dies. Now let's look at how the Vandals clashed with Rome. Rome lost control over Mauritania to the Vandals. In 434 AD, a treaty between the Vandals and Rome required the Roman Empire to remove its military and political presence from Northwest Africa. That treaty also allowed the Vandals to settle in the provinces of Nubia, but not in Carthage. However, in 439 AD, catching the Romans off guard as they were heavily preoccupied with conflicts in Gaul, the Vandal king broke the treaty and took the city of Carthage anyway. So let's look at a picture of the North African territories that were conceded to the Vandals by Rome. This is a picture North Africa, zoomed in on portions of Mauritania. You see that in the middle, the leftmost side. And to the right, in the dark, we see Nubia. And if we continue to the right, we'll see the Africa Proconsularis. And right above Africa Proconsularis, you'll see Carthage. Well, according to the treaty, the Vandals will only to stay in that dark area of Nubia, right there. According to the treaty, that's where they're supposed to be. However, breaking the treaty in 439 AD, the Vandals captured the city of Carthage and moved their capital there. And as a side note, they also advanced north across the Mediterranean Sea into Sicily and invaded there as well. So those were the clashes with the Berbers and with Rome. Next is how one author describes the clashes with the Donatists and the Catholic Christians in North Africa. Because both were Trinitarians, they became the targets of Vandal persecution. As a result of the treaty, North African Catholic churches were left without the protection of Rome. Taking advantage of the vulnerable Christians, the Vandal king banished Catholic bishops from their African jurisdiction, and then began a violent persecution of Christians. In Vanished Cities of Northern Africa, Stuart Erskine describes the invasion. She says, the Africa of their invasion was the Africa of Augustine and many saintly people. Their rapacity knew no bounds. Their cruelty was abnormal, and they laid waste and never rebuilt. They found Africa flourishing and left it desolate, its people reduced to slavery. The Church of Africa, so important in those early days of Christianity, practically non-existent. Let's consider the following summarized accounts of outrageous Vandal persecutions against Donatists and Catholic Christians in North Africa for their belief in the Holy Trinity. Now remember, this is 130 years after the end of Rome's persecution of African Christians. Vandal persecution of African Christians. We're going to look at their cruelty as expressed in the deceitful oath and in the persecution in particular. The Vandal king promised to spare any bishop as well as the persecution in that bishop's district in exchange for pledging an oath to declare his son the heir to the Vandal throne in North Africa. Now, after a bishop's pledge had been recorded, they were banished to cultivate fields anyway. They were forbidden to sing, to pray, to teach, to preach, to baptize, or even hold a book to read. But the bishops who refused to pledge the oath were banished also to the island of Corsica to cut timber to build the king's ships. That was the deceitful oath. The king had no intentions of keeping that oath, as we would see in the persecutions. Before banishing the bishops, the deceitful king had already initiated simultaneous tortures, beatings, hangings, and burning at the stake throughout the towns and provinces of all the bishops. He spared only people who renounced their belief that Christ's nature and the Father's nature were of the same substance. One particular persecution story is very interesting. You'll see it in the book. Is that of Dionysia of Africa. Victor Avita describes her torture in one of the towns as being contrary to the laws of nature. There are far more details in your SCAR survey book. But please note here that the eastern region of the Roman Empire had not been invaded by the Vandals. In fact, it had its own emperor, and in the following decades would elevate another African Berber to Pope of Rome. And that would be Pope Gelasius I. The fall of the Roman Empire was, for the most part, the collapse of the western region of the empire. The eastern region became known as the Byzantine Empire. In 492 AD, the church in the east elevated the African Gelasius, a Berber, to Pope. He settled the theological split between the Byzantine Emperor and the Patriarch of Constantinople. The Patriarch held the view that Christ's nature was not both human and divine, which was a common view in the East. Gelasius outlined the elements of Christ's dual nature in his book On the Dual Nature of Christ, then declared it as the universal point of view for all of Christendom. Given the fall of the Northwest African Church, Gelasius advocated for the primacy of Rome over the entire church, east and west. This was to ensure theological consistency and avoid sure conflicts. Gelasius authored the most celebrated document of the ancient church about priestly spiritual authority and their secular temporal authority. We can credit or we can blame the African Gelasius I for the idea of Rome being the central focus of Christendom. Shortly thereafter, in Africa's Mauritania region, another Berber came into power as a king. Remember, the Berbers were able to resist the Vandals and establish their self-rule. The Berber king Masuna and Byzantine Emperor Justinian conquered the Vandals. Masuna was a Romeo-Moorish king in Mauritania, Caesarensis, from 508 through 535 AD. A Berber himself, he ruled a kingdom of Christian Berbers. He is assumed to be a Christian, though. Masuna's kingdom maintained its independence by resisting occupation by the Vandals during the 6th century. It is also believed that his kingdom's independence was key to Donatism surviving the Vandal invasion as well. He is the earliest recorded ruler of this kingdom that had been established by the local Berber chieftains and rulers following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. During the Vandalic War of 533 AD, over 100 years after their initial invasion, King Masuna aided Justinian, the Byzantine emperor, in the reconquest of North African territories taken by the Vandals. Later, under a confederation, Masuna would also aid Justinian in wars against invading Berber tribes. It is very difficult to win a war fighting the enemy on foreign soil without the help of local people. With the defeat of the Vandals, Byzantine Christianity unfolds. And we'll get back to the topic of Byzantine Christianity later. But around this time, Christianity has taken hold in Nubia in East Africa. So let's look at the gradual rise of Christianity in Nubia. So when did it occur? Gradually between the 4th and the 6th century AD. Where? Territories along its northern desert frontier and the Nile River. How? People of diverse cultural backgrounds traveling to and fro. Based on what? Inscription and artifact evidence. First, let's locate Nubia in Africa on the map. Nobatia, Makaria, Aladia, the frontier regions. That's today's Sudan and South Sudan. Again, the 4th to the 6th century. Christianity gradually arose in Nubia through its Christian neighbors, the desert communities of Egypt to the north and Ethiopia to the southeast. Now, this map of East Africa lists territories that are closer to our time today. So in red, I've identified those key Nubian locations to give you a gist of where Nubia was located between the 4th and the 6th centuries. Let's point specifically to the desert frontier region north of Nubia, where Egyptians and also Ethiopians and Nubians and others traveled to and fro. So the desert frontier was where interactions occurred between people, diverse cultures, as they traversed to and fro between Thebes and Nubia. Here in the desert region, right there where you see the brackets north of Nubia, is the territory that exists between Thebes, if you can see it in light blue to the right of the word Egypt, and Nubia. That was desert territory. And as you can see, the Nile River traverses from the Mediterranean through the desert territory and through Nubian territory. So the desert and the Nile were instrumental in terms of travelers traversing. Also, the desert is where diverse values and beliefs collided, combined, or were abandoned. The desert frontier was the perfect venue to facilitate the gradual movement of Christian ideas southward from Egypt along the Nile into Nubian territory. Egyptian desert hermits and their desert communities and Christian monks facilitated the flow of Christian thought. Quite often, travelers, even kings, will leave inscriptions on the once great but ancient Nubian civilization temples and structures in what became the desert frontier. So let's consider 4 inscription evidences in particular that have Christian implications before Byzantine Christianity had arrived. The first, do you remember the 4th century Ethiopian king Usana from a couple of sessions ago? His subduing Nubians was significant in that by the late 4th century and the entire 5th century AD, it is believed that both Ethiopia and the Coptic Christians of Egypt were instrumental in the gradual Christianization of Nubia. On what's known as the Ezana stone is an inscription describing his victory over the Nubians. Let's look at the second inscription, which is by the Nubian king Silko. In 1819, archaeologists discovered the triumphant inscription of the Nubian king Silko, written on the temple of Kalapshia. The inscription is dated a century before the arrival of Byzantine Christian missionaries. The inscription describes Silko's military campaign to drive out the Blamese nomads around 537 AD. And you see those 2 images to the right. The lower image is the image of the inscription on the temple wall. It reads, "God granted me victory, and I am a lion in the lower region and a bear in the upper regions." Now, Silko is credited with making the way for Christianity to sprout in Nubia. Notice on the upper image, he inscribed an angel and he inscribes a warrior. The warrior supposedly is him, the angel supposedly sent by God, who helped grant him that victory. Now, it's interesting that bears live in neither Nubia nor Egypt, yet Silko makes reference to a bear. The reason why this is significant is because Silko, the Nubian king, used metaphors that the Old Testament prophets used, that Samuel used, that Jeremiah used, that Hosea used, and the prophet Amos used. And there are scriptures there for you to look at further. Now, the next 2 inscriptions were on abandoned ancient pagan temples in the desert. And they were even more specific. Let's take a look at them. We have an inscription by Paul the priest, and we have an inscription that was left under authority of the Nubian king Hipponom. Paul the priest, his inscription is dated after 550 AD in Gelasius. There are two Coptic inscriptions written on the left pylon in front of the temple, and they read, 1, I, Paul the priest, prayed here for the first time. The second inscription, I, Paul the priest, set up the cross here for the first time. And the inscription that was left under authority of the Nubian king Hipponom was also written in the Coptic language. It refers to the rededication of the pagan temple of Dendor as a Christian church. It reads, by the will of God and the order of King Hipponom and the eager student of the word of God, Joseph, the exarch of Thomas. And as we receive the cross from Theodore, the bishop of Philae, I, Abraham, the most humble priest, set up the cross on the day on which the foundation of this church was laid. This is the first official Christian document from Nubia. It goes on to proclaim that from that time forward, Christianity was the state religion of Nubia. If these encryption evidences that were found that demonstrated Christian activity weren't enough for you, there's also artifact evidence found in Nubia that contain Christian symbols and images on them. Let's take a look at them. Artifact evidence of gradual Christianization. The excavated artifact evidence were what 19th century European excavators and archaeologists and historians could validate as being Christian based on their understanding of institutionalized Christianity. So it is possible that other artifact evidence may have existed, but were uniquely indigenous to 6th century AD Nubian Christian expressions that differ from Europeans. So what I'm listing here as the artifacts were discovered are the only ones that the Europeans could identify as Christian. So let's take a look at these recognized Christian artifacts that were discovered. Ritual lamps, wall paintings, ecclesiastical remains, a mud church, other inscriptions, and objects of daily use. But artifacts were not only found amongst the common citizens of Nubia. There's artifact evidence among the royalty as well. Between 1931 and 1934, artifact evidence of Christian influence was discovered inside 122 Nubian royal tombs in Balana and Custol. They were dated to the time after the collapse of the Meroitic state from 360 to 420 AD, but before Byzantine Christian Nubia. One excavator reported Christian symbols have been found on possessions of obvious native manufacture, such as leather quivers, on poverty after baking. He went on to describe a silver reliquary with figures of Christ and the apostles in relief. These artifacts were found amongst the tombs of Nubian royalty well over a century before Byzantine Christian influence. This is not odd. Ever since the 1st century AD, Messianic Hebrew followers of Christ lived in Libya and in Egypt, just north of Nubia. Also in the 1st century AD, in Ethiopia, just south of Nubia. The Ethiopian eunuch brought the gospel there. Then in the 4th century AD, Ezana, king of Ethiopia, declared Christianity as its state religion. So these 5th century AD Christian artifacts among Nubian royalty should be no surprise. Here's how one scholar describes Christianity's presence along Africa's east coast. His review in the Journal of African History, Noel Q. Keene, details African Christianity's resilience along its eastern coastline. He states, there has been no break in the continuity of life of the Coptic and Ethiopian churches, and their importance for the future of Christianity in Africa is not likely to be passed over. Even the Church of Nubia, whose pillars now lie in the dust, made its contribution to African Christianity as a whole. Nearly 2,000 years later, there is a strong presence of Christians along Africa's eastern coastline in Egypt, in Ethiopia, and Eritrea. So the question is, what happened to Christianity in Northwest Africa? So let's talk about the disappearance of Christianity in Northwest Africa. After Emperor Justinian and King Masuna's reconquest of North Africa, Justinian began to unify what was left of the Catholic Church with what remained of the empire. He discouraged all divisive tendencies within the church, including Donatism. Despite unification attempts and the Donatists' dwindling wealth, they would not embrace the Byzantine Union. Byzantine Christianity never furthered the progress of the church's mission, as the early African church had progressed former pagans into followers of Christ. Instead, the 100 years of Byzantine rule in Africa were filled with internal conflicts. Remaining were a reduced, vulnerable, doctrinally anemic, and bewildered scattering of Christians who struggled to recruit their identity and existence as the church. After 5.5 years and 216 resources referenced for this research, only a collage portrayal was possible from piecing back together Africa's early church history from the 1st through the 6th century AD. Fortunately, enough has been recorded and preserved to illuminate forgotten episodes of her history and to give visibility to her courageous believers. All were at the risk of being lost to oblivion. In Stuart Erskine's book, Vanished Cities of Northern Africa, she offers this summary. The early Christian church in Africa was, it will be remembered, ruined by the seditions that rose up. The Africans were sincere believers, but independent, argumentative, intensely combative. They were only too ready to fight to the death with anyone who opposed their convictions. They sacrificed to their prejudices the whole future, not only of Christianity, but of civilization. So much is unchronicled, lost, or yet revealed. Thank God for enabling us to glimpse into Africa's early church spirit, her sincere and independent spirit, with strong convictions, was often oppressed and resisted institutionalization. I liken her history and spirit to the once fortified African Berber village of Thugga. This village had preserved some of its native characteristics, despite having become a Carthaginian colony, obscurely Romanized city, Byzantine citadel, then fell to the Arians, Donatists, Vandals, and then to the Arabs. Yet, in the early 20th century, found Thugga back as an African village. Like Thugga, once again surviving is the history of the African church. After failed attempts of the Byzantine Empire to unify with what was left of the Catholic Church, with what remained of the empire, arose a new and young religion in Africa. The rise of Islam. Dr. Noel Quentin King, one of the few scholars belonging to the old school of learning, who founded the University of California at Santa Cruz, he wrote, "The main reason for the disappearance of Christianity in the Northwest of the African continent may well have been the beauty of incoming young Islam compared with the tired Christianity left by the great struggles between Donatists and the others, eking out an existence in a society ruined by barbarian invasion and East Roman conquests." In Miss Stewart Erskine's book, Vanished Cities, Northern Africa, she wrote, "The Muslim empire without boundaries, without political divisions, swept over Northern Africa, carrying the Berbers in its onrush like a great tidal wave." By 700 AD, Mauritania, Carthage, Libya, and most of the North Africans, except for the Egyptian Coptics, fell to the Arabs. These accounts of African church history must not be lost. end of the course on the history of African Christian church, from Jesus' resurrection to the rise of Islam. Purchase the book, Surveying Christianity's African Roots by Jimmy Compton. Like us on Facebook.